The city is quiet in the early morning heat. The call to prayer fades into the distance as glass towers catch the first light of the sun. Inside a government complex sealed behind layers of security, a routine announcement is prepared, brief, technical, almost bureaucratic. No crowds gather. No alarm sound. No headlines flash across television screens. Yet this moment marks the quiet end of a system that shaped the modern world. For more than half a century, a single rule governed global energy trade. Oil was priced in US dollars. Not sometimes. Not usually. Always. Every barrel, every contract, every shipment that powered planes, factories, hospitals, and cities across the planet was tied to one currency. That rule no longer exists. There are no celebrations. No emergency meetings broadcast live. Just a short confirmation that an old agreement will not be renewed. To most observers, it looks like a footnote. To history, it may read as a turning point. Because the agreement that expired in 2025 was never just about oil. It was about power. It was about trust. And it was about a paradox that defined the modern American era. How a nation that imported more than it exported, borrowed endlessly, and printed money without restraint became the central pillar of the global financial system. To understand why this matters, we must return to a very different moment in time, when the dollar itself was on the brink. August 15, 1971. Washington, D.C. The Oval Office is tense. President Richard Nixon stares into a camera late on a Sunday night and delivers a message that shocks the world. The United States will no longer convert dollars into gold. The promise made at Bretton Woods, linking the dollar to something tangible, ends overnight. What follows is uncertainty. If the dollar is no longer backed by gold, why should the world trust it? The answer does not come immediately. It takes 3 years, a geopolitical crisis, and a carefully constructed deal forged behind closed doors. In 1974, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger travels to Saudi Arabia. The oil shocks of the early 1970s have crippled Western economies. Energy is no longer just fuel, it is leverage. The agreement that emerges is elegant in its simplicity. Saudi Arabia will sell oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, the United States will provide military protection, political backing, and access to American financial markets. Through OPEC, the model spreads. Oil, the lifeblood of industrial civilization, becomes inseparable from the dollar. And just like that, the dollar finds a new anchor. Not gold, oil. This arrangement creates an invisible engine beneath the global economy. Every country that needs energy must acquire dollars first. Those dollars are earned through trade, borrowed through debt, or held as reserves. The system generates constant demand for U.S. currency, regardless of how much the United States prints, borrows, or spends. This is the central paradox. The dollar's strength is no longer tied to discipline, but to dependence. For decades, the system works. America runs deficits without consequence. Inflation flows outward. Manufacturing moves overseas. Debt accumulates. And yet the dollar remains dominant because the world needs it, until slowly it doesn't. By the early 21st century, cracks begin to appear. New powers rise. Old alliances strain. Sanctions turn currency into a weapon. Energy markets diversify. Technology changes settlement systems. And countries begin to ask a dangerous question. What happens if the dollar is no longer neutral? The expiration of the Petrodollar agreement in 2025 does not cause collapse overnight. But it removes a keystone, a quiet structural support that most people never knew existed. And history shows us something unsettling. Reserve currencies do not fall suddenly. They fade. They are questioned. They are hedged against. And then one day, they are replaced. This story is not about prediction. It is about patterns. And once you see the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. The architecture of dollar power. To understand the implications of the petrodollar's decline, we must first understand how the system actually worked, not in slogans, but in mechanics. After 1974, oil-exporting nations accumulated massive dollar surpluses. These dollars did not sit idle. They flowed back into U.S. Treasury bonds, American banks, and Western financial markets. This process, known as petrodollar recycling, financed U.S. deficits at historically low interest rates. The system produced three reinforcing effects. First, it ensured permanent demand for dollars. Second, it allowed the U.S. to borrow cheaply and endlessly. Third, it embedded American financial institutions at the center of global trade. This was not an accident. It was design. Key architects included policymakers at the U.S. Treasury, Federal Reserve, and State Department, alongside Saudi financial authorities and major Wall Street banks. Their motives were not conspiratorial. They were strategic. Stability, influence, and control. But systems built for one era rarely survive the next unchanged. The weaponization of currency. The turning point comes not from economics, but from geopolitics. In the 2000s and 2010s, the United States increasingly uses financial infrastructure as a tool of foreign policy. Sanctions freeze reserves. Payment systems exclude entire nations. Dollar clearing becomes conditional. For policymakers, this is leverage. For the rest of the world, it is a warning. Russia accelerates de-dollarization after sanctions. China builds parallel payment systems. Bilateral trade agreements begin settling in local currencies. Central banks quietly diversify reserves. These moves are not ideological. They are defensive. By 2020, the dollar still dominates, but its share of global reserves is shrinking. Not collapsing, shrinking. This distinction matters. Empires rarely fall from attack. They erode from adaptation elsewhere. Saudi Arabia's strategic shift. Saudi Arabia's decision not to renew the petrodollar framework is not a rejection of the United States. It is a recalibration. The kingdom faces a multipolar world. China is its largest energy customer. Asia is its growth market. Diversification is rational. Accepting multiple currencies does not end dollar usage, but it ends exclusivity. And exclusivity was the point. Once oil can be priced in more than one currency, the automatic demand loop weakens. Countries no longer need to hold as many dollars just in case. Small changes compound. Historical precedents. This pattern has played out before. The Spanish silver dollar dominated global trade in the 16th century, until overextension and debt diluted trust. The Dutch guilder thrived during the age of maritime commerce, until wars and competition eroded dominance. The British pound ruled the 19th century, until 2 world wars and financial exhaustion ended its reign. Each system believed itself indispensable. Each was eventually replaced, not by collapse, but by transition. The U.S. dollar's post-1944 dominance is exceptional in scale, but not in nature. The mechanisms are familiar. The domestic consequences. If global demand for dollars weakens, consequences appear at home first. Borrowing becomes more expensive. Imports cost more. Inflation becomes harder to export. Policy options narrow. Raising interest rates strengthens the currency, but stresses debt and employment. Lowering rates supports growth, but risks credibility. There is no single moment of failure. Only trade-offs. History does not collapse in a single moment. It exhales. The systems that define eras rarely end with fire or headlines. They fade quietly, replaced piece by piece, assumption by assumption, until one day the world wakes up inside a new reality and wonders when the old one disappeared. That is where we are now. The petrodollar system, once the invisible engine of American financial dominance, did not fail because of rebellion or ideology. It ended because the conditions that made it necessary no longer exist in the same way. Energy markets changed. Power diversified. Trust fragmented. And nations adapted, not out of hostility, but out of self-preservation. For decades, the dollar's dominance was reinforced not by discipline, but by necessity. Oil demand guaranteed currency demand. Currency demand financed debt. Debt funded growth, security, and influence. It was a closed loop, remarkably resilient, remarkably profitable, and remarkably fragile once alternatives emerged. What made the system powerful was also what made it vulnerable. Because when confidence replaces compulsion, even small shifts matter. The expiration of the Petrodollar agreement in 2025 does not trigger an instant collapse. History is rarely that dramatic. Instead, it removes a stabilizer, one that quietly absorbed pressure for half a century. Without it, stresses that once dispersed globally begin to concentrate domestically. This is how reserve currencies end. Not with rejection, but with options. When countries no longer must hold dollars, they ask how much they should. When trade can be settled in multiple currencies, exclusivity disappears. When reserves diversify gradually, dominance erodes invisibly. And by the time the change is undeniable, the transition is already complete. We have seen this before. The British pound did not collapse the day it lost reserve status. London remained influential. British institutions persisted. But the center of gravity shifted elsewhere. Capital followed stability. Trade followed growth. And the world reorganized itself around a new axis. The same pattern echoes across centuries. What distinguishes the present moment is scale. Never before has a single currency underpinned global trade, energy, finance, and debt at this magnitude. Never before has one nation relied so deeply on external demand for its liabilities to sustain domestic living standards. And never before has technological and geopolitical change moved so quickly, compressing decades of transition into years. This does not mean catastrophe is inevitable. It means adjustment is unavoidable. A world with a weaker dollar is not necessarily a world without a dollar. It is a world where U.S. policy choices carry sharper consequences, where deficits cost more, where inflation cannot be effortlessly exported, where credibility matters more than momentum. And that is the quiet shift now underway. The most dangerous assumption in history is permanence. Every empire believed its system was different, more advanced, more justified, more secure. And everyone eventually discovered that power is not owned. It is borrowed from circumstance. The United States still possesses immense strengths, innovation, institutions, resources, influence. But the monetary privilege that insulated those strengths from discipline is no longer absolute. And when insulation fades, reality becomes louder. For individuals, this transition is invisible at first. Prices rise slowly. Purchasing power erodes subtly. Savings lose value not through collapse, but through dilution. The change feels personal, but its roots are systemic. That is why understanding history matters. Not to predict exact outcomes, but to recognize trajectories. The petrodollar did not fail because it was evil or flawed. It ended because the world outgrew the conditions that sustained it. And the dollar's future will be shaped not by fear or denial, but by how societies adapt to that change. Some will pretend nothing is happening. Others will study the pattern. Because history does not reward certainty. It rewards awareness. We are living through a transition that future textbooks will summarize in a paragraph. But those who lived inside it will remember the confusion, the disbelief, and the moment when the old rules quietly stopped working. The petrodollar's fall is not the end of the story. It is the end of a chapter. What comes next will define how wealth is stored, how power is exercised, and how stability is measured in the decades ahead. And, as always, those who recognize structural change early do not panic. They prepare. Not with predictions, not with panic, but with understanding. Because currencies rise and fall, systems evolve, and history moves forward whether we are watching or not. The question is not whether the dollar disappears. The question is whether those who depend on it recognize the shift before the consequences arrive. And that question has echoed through every monetary transition in history. The answer has never been evenly distributed.